Hi, hello. My name is Laurent Lavollay-Porter. I'm a bilingual Montessorian for 3 to 6-year-olds and 6 to 12-year-olds. And I'm going to be talking to you today about humility. I wanted to start this conference, this online conference, with a little anecdote which happened to me during my first year of teaching. This is about 9 years ago, and I was an assistant in the classroom, and we had a young, wonderful boy, very young, 3.5-year-old, who definitely had his challenges with respecting other people's space, and very dynamic and very smart, but definitely in need of a lot of attention. So let's just say we had him on a pretty tight leash. This boy's name is John. So around the end of November and beginning of December, John comes to me one morning, and I'm presenting a practical life activity to a child, and he interrupts me. He says, "Excuse me, Laurent, but I don't think I'm going to be here next semester." We'd met with his parents several times, and he definitely got himself into quite a bit of trouble. And I look to him and I say, "Of course you're going to be here, John. This is your home. This is your children's house. These are your friends, and everybody loves you here." And next to me, I had another child called Marcus, and I go, "Marcus, isn't John going to be here next semester?" And Marcus goes. Next to Marcus, I have another second-year child, and I say to her, "Emma, isn't John going to be here next semester?" And Emma goes, "I don't think so." Finally, this first-year child, Benjamin, comes up to me running, and I say, "Benjamin, tell me something. We're discussing John right now. Don't you think that John is going to be here next semester?" And Benjamin looks up at me and he says, "I want to sleep with John." So that was one of my funniest moments in the classroom, and I couldn't have expected it if I tried. There's no way I could have invented it, and it just came upon me, and I had to use all of my might in order not to crack up laughing as I was in the middle of a presentation with children and keeping my calm. So this kind of leads me to the topic of this speech and this talk, and the talk is, as I've announced, humility, the importance of humility to become a good Montessori guide and to become a good Montessori colleague, generally speaking. So one of the reasons I chose to speak to you today about humility is because somebody recently asked me, what is the limit to tolerance? So they asked me, what are your limits to tolerance? And it took me a while, and I had to take a pause, and I really thought about this. And after a while, I came up with the fact that it must be ego. So I answered, I think it's ego. I'm not really sure if ego is the contrary to humility, but that's about as close to it as I can figure. I also chose this topic because Montessori is a child-led education. So we must learn to adapt, to appreciate and to respect and work around the child's self-construction, around the child's individual rhythm. Then we must facilitate the creation of the child, his work, and this is really difficult to do. So with all that said, I think it's important also to keep up with national standards, of course. So as was so widely lectured to me a couple of years ago by Rukmini, who is a Montessori trainer in Navadisha, she lectured to us about school reports and progress reports, and she said to us, adults are not here to act for children. The child is the syllabus, and his development or independence are universal. At conception, Dr. Montessori saw that there's already something there. It's not a starting point, since all the conditions are put together for unlimited potential. As we all know, 0 to 3-year-olds are adapting mostly. 3 to 6-year-olds are crystallizing all of this information and all of this experience, and they really want to practice what they've learned, their balance and their walking. They want to practice with their new brain that they've developed from ages 0 to 2.5, the absorbent mind. 6 to 12-year-olds are going to follow this intellectual, abstract journey of learning in a cosmic education, what we call cosmic education. And they can also think in the abstract, which is different from the first plane, 0 to 6-year-old. Then we talk about 12 and 15 and 15 to 18-year-olds who should be closely linked to nature, living on a farm, potentially the Erdkinder, as it's called. And they must hopefully continue to learn with joy and following their self-interests, their interests. So Rukmini, the trainer, asked us one question at the beginning of this lecture, and she said, do we as Montessorians have sympathy for those who don't know as much as we do about children? Parents offer unconditional love and support to their babies, she said. So how can we give unconditional blame to parents for what they're doing? There's a really strong view that we as Montessorians might be superior or better. So we really have to act with humility. So I'm thrilled to be speaking today about this rather abstract, but really crucial topic of my Montessori experience. I'm particularly thrilled to be speaking to you from Paris, France, because I understand I'm the only person speaking from France altogether. So bonjour and salut to all of you from Paris. So how did I get into this racket? Who am I and under what authority am I speaking to you? I attended the bilingual Montessori school of Paris from ages 2 to 6. I was a child there, a student there. And since then, in the more recent past, in the past 20 years, I'm old now, I replaced teachers a lot. I replaced toddler teachers, and I replaced children's house teachers, and I replaced administrators for summers. And it's over these past 30 years, really, that really got me to thinking about Montessori. So I've really been thinking about Montessori my whole entire life, to be honest. Whether from close or from far, I have been looking at the school and working at the school. So at a certain stage, I even considered opening a school in New York City, which I'm really glad I didn't, because considering the lack of experience I had, probably would have been an absolute disaster. After a film career and after a finance career in New York City and shortly in London, I must admit that there's not a lot of humility in finance and film, so that's another topic there. But I returned to my native Paris. So I returned to Paris in 2012. And with one foot through the door, became what I consider my Hotel California. I could check in anytime I wanted, but I could never leave. So sometime back in 2012, I toured the original space with my mother, the library of the American Cathedral in Paris, where she in 1972 had been a 38-year-old and coming off a job in the corporate world in New York City. And as I toured the space in 2012, I was a 38-year-old coming off a finance job in New York City and London. So this moment weighed on me and really felt like the circle is complete moment here. I knew that this moment was kind of an epiphany for me, and I definitely felt the weight of the responsibility on my shoulders. The circle is complete. It was at this precise moment that I decided we needed to open an elementary, for no other reason than the fact that if 2 to 6-year-old children can experience so much joy and happiness in a bilingual French and English environment, we have to offer this to 6+-year-olds as well. I never forgot myself how I'd suffered, I'm sorry to say, in the French traditional school system, how I'd been humiliated by the directress of the school at a certain point when grades were all that mattered, and we were all 8 years old, and the directress would come in and we'd all stand up, military style, and she announced the grades. And on that particular day, I was the second to last worst grade. I reflected on this moment for a long time later on in my life, and I really thought about the objective of having the children stand up at age 8 and announcing the grades to every other student in the classroom. This has fomented lots of stress and lots of anxiety in students, and I believe it continues to do so today. This is where Montessori is so revolutionary, though. This experience in the French traditional system, which was not a bad experience, but was sometimes, as I said, very difficult, it added a lot of conviction to my Montessori mission here in France. So since 2012, I've been an assistant in the classroom. I've been a co-teacher in English, a co-teacher in French, an Anglophone guide, a Francophone guide in the children's house, in the elementary, and I've also been an administrator, as I told you. I graduated from the Maria Montessori Institute with a 3 to 6 AMI diploma. I also graduated with my 6 to 12 diploma from the same institute in London with incredible trainers, I'm lucky to say. These trainings, if grueling and fascinating, were transformative. I have to admit that entering the Montessori classroom was even more humbling and more transformative. As an Anglophone guide and as an administrator and director of development, and as a Montessori consultant, I now realize the full spectrum and the importance of humility in working with young children and being a Montessori colleague as well. Humility, after having sold the school in the past 3 months, is a big topic for me. I go over all the mistakes that I've made, and I go over all the challenges that I've had, and I also go over all the successes that I've had. And humility, I truly believe, is one of the principal, most important aspects of being a good Montessori guide, once again. So having sold the school and being a consultant and a director of development, the circle, once again, is complete after almost 10 years on the job. I'd like to share with you a journal entry that I wrote my first summer of training in London. And it reads, "I'm happy to have a short break from this training." This was 2 months in. "It's quite fascinating to study not only the child, but the adult, and the point of view from which Montessori sees the child. I hope and believe that I'll learn as much about the child as I will about myself, since so many strange feelings have invaded me since I began the training. I'm rather calm, but I return to my life as a young 3-year-old boy, exploring the sensorial materials that I once manipulated in my school. I had wanted to do some therapy, even some hypnosis, to reach inner peace. But now, what I'm doing is way more intense. I wanted to do I'm studying all the time, I'm working all the time, and I don't even have any more time to ask myself these questions. I'm thrilled because this path is difficult, and I'm also thrilled because it's a true opportunity. It's a work of service. I exist now only as a participant, as an observer to a certain degree, and I can only give my person and my time. I must suddenly learn so much, take a huge step back. I must observe and use all the time I'm allocated to the analysis and the observations that I'll be doing. If the course load of my AMI diploma were certainly humbling, they were just the tip of the iceberg. I adhere to Maria Montessori's philosophy wholeheartedly because her approach to human development is holistic. It's biological, it's empirical, and scientific. She'd suggest materials originally, and she would expand on a philosophy. And eventually she observed that the child exists only through his work, because he's constructing himself. Her approach is also holistic, taking into account the physical, the emotional, the spiritual, and the intellectual approach, and the needs of the children. Her hand being the tool of the mind, this hand which will craft the spirit. And to this point, Rukmini says it brilliantly. Again, the trainer in Chennai. Montessori didn't stop at a theory. She gave the idea of a prepared environment. Froebel and Pestalozzi had theories, but Montessori applied theory to an education. She applied theory to an education and a prepared environment. She translated her philosophy of the child in all of this material and this prepared environment. She says, we're ready to understand the child's physical needs, but are we ready to feed his soul? How not to be humble, hence, in front of this stark and huge reality. One must have a vision, I wrote to myself, but not just any vision. A vision inspired by the child. The child is born of energy, of desire, of purity, of insatiable will. It's not indeed too late for us adults, I wrote, if we could come back to the roots and deeply believe within ourselves that we're good and pure. Since the child is born good and productive and fair and kind and generous, he's an intelligent explorer. And since we were all children, I deeply believe I'm good, but I'm 38 now. I must actively reduce the harmful deviations of my constant forward charge, of my work, of my thinking. I wrote this close to 9 years ago, but it really rings true today still. Each training, as I said, is transformative, but barely as transformative as each year spent leading a Montessori classroom with 25 students, 25 children. I know nothing scarier and more impressive than having the responsibility of 25 young souls. I remember leaving my classroom in my early years, oftentimes in tears. I would leave the classroom and I would just think to myself, how can it be? How can 3, 4, and 5-year-olds just walk all over me? How can they be so disobedient? What am I doing wrong? Why can't they sit there and do the presentations like we learned them so perfectly in our training centers? I really felt like the world's worst teacher. So as I grew and become more experienced though, I realized that these young beings could only unfold if they were following their own interior plan. This plan of development, this normalization, allowed for infinite possibilities. So how could I possibly know more about them than they do, these uncharted territories? It was impossible. It's impossible, but for my training and observations, impossible but for the diligent application of presenting over and over and over again. The only way forward is getting the children to work. My mother said it for 50 years, and I say it now. Let them get to work. Do the best you can with them. Connect them to the material, offer them that freedom. Connecting the material offers them the freedom of choice, the freedom of action, the freedom of work, the freedom to think. Connect them to this brilliant and scientific didactic apparatus, Montessori said. In other words, become this dynamic link to the materials. These materials that, by the way, were the results of decades of empirical experimentation, and these materials, which we now know today as evidence of one of the best learning material in the world. The concepts taught in trainings rush to the fore now, and the cloak of humility began to emerge. Present, present, present. We were taught 30 to 40 times every morning. Link the child to the material. Gift her with the opportunity to do for herself. Presenting means connecting the child to the material, which means offering him or her the opportunity to do for herself, for himself. And do this by offering useful help, not useless help. Don't become the obstacle in the room. One of my elementary trainers told us a wonderful story one morning. She said, you're trying to give the child knowledge. It's the same as preparing a beautiful, warm oatmeal breakfast. You put some blueberries on there. You top it off with some beautiful, delicious, grade A Canadian maple syrup. And then you eat it. And then you're wondering why the child has not received any nutrition. Don't take away the child's intense, delectable pleasure of discovering and learning something for himself. Don't eat the child's breakfast for him, she told us. Allow and offer the space and opportunity to explore, the children the opportunity and the space to explore, to think through and to discover the abstract knowledge which they crave. Allow the beautiful and attractive Montessori materials to do their job. After all, they're materialized abstractions. They possess the control of error. They allow for repetition. They indicate the child when he's using it wrong. Once again, a bit of humility will really go a long way. So with humility, I've witnessed true development and independence and autonomy in very, very young children. I've been surprised. I've been amazed. I see them develop coordinated movement, logical thought, and respect for one another. I see them develop grace and courtesy and social skills because we have one of each material. That means wait your turn. That means developing your executive function. That means, do you respect your peer? Can you have the self-control required, which, by the way, later in life is a fundamental skill for success, we've now proven. Such brilliant education can only take place if we work in service to the child. If we actually wear the cloak of humility, if we empty ourselves of ego, of worry and fear. Psychological presentation is paramount. Each day is a new day. Each day we trust that the child holds goodness and that his true nature will reveal himself and itself through work. That true development comes from within. As a humble Montessorian, we have the responsibility to honor the inner guide of the child and to love them and to trust them deeply because they can feel it. Their absorbent mind's in full swing. So we must be calm and gentle and peaceful. Let us rid the child's environment of any obstacles. We can be the obstacle. So observe, prepare the environment, assist, guide, and get out of the way. As one of my Montessori gurus told me, Mr. Peter Davidson, get out of the way. If you see the children working or observing calmly, they're following their natural path. With humility comes wisdom and true inner peace. Humility and observation were the optimal tools for me to truly experience the fascinating and genius secret of childhood that Dr. Maria Montessori talks about in her book. And it took place regularly, right in front of my eyes. And it took me years to understand this, and I still work on this to this day. One tool I applied consciously and practically in my physical and psychological preparation as a Montessori guide was walking to school. Each day, as I said, is a bright, new, promising day. But how can you do that? You've got to leave your worries at the door. I had the chance and the opportunity to walk over the Seine River every morning before entering the beautiful classroom where I worked with 25 children. And every morning, I would imagine the waters of the Seine River just purifying my soul and getting rid of all of my worries and all of my concerns. This was a really magical moment for me. And I could arrive at the doorstep of the school and walk up the stairs with a clean and pure spirit in order to tackle this day with hope and promise. I was there to be in service to the child. That's why I was there as a mere observer and putting all of my energy towards the development and the independence of these young beings. I realized that we have so much to learn from children. I've known and felt for a really long time that they know better than we do what's best for them. But to tell ourselves that children know better than we do is a really tall order for any naturally composed human being. It's a really tall thing to grasp and to understand on a lot of levels. But really, it's the only approach possible if we're going to really get close and truly connect and to work harmoniously with young children, I believe. Real maturity and balance come only when we are honest and humble. We must let go of ego and selfishness and self-centeredness, and we must listen and observe. If there's no such thing as perfection, I'm convinced that hard work and repetition will really get us closer to our better selves. And humility is what I recommend, and it's what I still strive for to this day. Humility is not standing by, it's not passive, it's not weak. It's a non-judgmental, objective, and clean, pure point of view. It's an objective look on things. The older I grow, the more I realize I don't know. Humility directly creates that space that children need and crave. It creates the space that they need and the challenges they need for them to grow and create themselves, for them to exist. I think that humility is also a great fomenter of harmony and peace. It's the only way that we're going to be creating a peaceful and harmonious environment for us and for our colleagues. Humility, as I write, is the ego's silence game. So let us hear and let us listen really to one another. This is the starting point. Thank you for listening.